You may not know this about me. Some people do know this about me, and I don't know why I'm going to tell you this because we have social media, and that could be bad. But I was raised in the 80s, and in the 80s there was this thing that was pretty popular called breakdancing. And you know how kids take like dance and gymnastics and stuff? Well, in the 80s, they actually offered breakdancing classes. And I was in one of these breakdancing classes, and we were good. And my breakdancing name was Quasar. And I say that because that music just there made me want to jump out in the middle of that aisle and just show you how good I am. Just kidding. Not really. I am serious. But if you're just joining us, we're kind of just over the hump in this series called Faith. We've been talking about, let me put this out because that's going to annoy me. Sorry if that's gross for you. When I was in student ministry, I'd be chewing gum and realize I'm speaking, and I'd ask a student, hey, come here. And they'd come up, and I'd put my gum in his hand, and it was really gross. I won't do that to you because we're adults now. But we're in this series called Faith, and we're looking at the life of Joseph from the Old Testament. Maybe you've heard of him, maybe you're new to church, maybe you're back to church, maybe you're not familiar at all with the Bible, but you might have heard of Joseph in the coat of many colors. That's the guy we're talking about. And he had a lot of brothers, and just to kind of catch you up in the series, Joseph was the favored son of his dad's favorite wife. And yeah, they had multiple wives. I'm really, really glad we don't have that anymore. I've got 2 daughters and a wife, and that's enough females in one house for me. Hey, got an amen maybe from there. All right, so careful, gentlemen. But this is the story of this guy. He was a favorite son of the favored wife, and he had all these older brothers, and they were so jealous of his dad. His dad made that coat of many colors because he loved him so much, and they were super jealous. And then he makes the mistake of telling his brothers about this dream, these visions that he had where they were going to worship him one day. And so if your brother or sister came to you and said, hey, I think God's going to make you worship me one day, I'm sure you would say, well, praise Jesus. Let's get to it. No, you would probably shove them down a flight of stairs or something like that. Well, they decided to try and kill him. And one of the brothers said, let's not kill him. Let's put him in a pit and figure something out to do. They end up selling him into slavery. He goes to live in Egypt. And the thing about that life, and the thing about Joseph's dreams that he had at that point that we discussed, is that we all have dreams, right? We all grew up hoping to have a certain kind of life, to live a certain way, to achieve certain things in this life. And somewhere along the road, some of those dreams died. You know, you dreamed of being like 6'2" and a popular athlete with broad shoulders and a deep voice. No, just me? Okay. But we have those dreams, and some of them are unrealized, and we discussed, like Joseph, that our response to unrealized dreams reveals the source of our faith. For Joseph, when those dreams were unrealized, he continued in faith. His faith was unwavering because his faith was not based in circumstance. His faith was not based in relationship. His faith in God and God's faithfulness, God's sovereignty, God's power, his control over everything. And so we looked at our own lives. How are we responding to those unrealized dreams in our life? Do they cause us to have a crisis of faith? Do we start to question everything? Do we go into depression? How do we respond? Because that reveals where the source of our faith is. And then last week we looked at Joseph's story as he goes to Egypt. He lands in the house of Potiphar, a high-ranking chief official in Pharaoh's kind of court. And he's such a good slave. He's such a man of character that Potiphar actually puts him in charge of everything in his house. And Potiphar, the Bible tells us that the only thing that Potiphar had to worry about was what he was going to eat that day. That's how much he trusted Joseph. And that that Joseph, we know from the Bible, was a good-looking guy. Again, I'm not really sure why God chose to tell us that, but he did. Just to remind me that I'm short and old and overweight and all those good things. But Joseph's good-looking, and then Potiphar, his wife, is the kind of a co-owner of this slave, and she kind of advances on Joseph, and she's used to getting her way, but he says no. He kind of refuses her advances, and she is enraged by this. She's enraged to the point that she sets up this entire scenario where she's alone with Joseph, and she really just kind of puts it all out there and tries to get him into bed, and he runs out of the room, leaving his garment behind, to which Potiphar's wife then tells this tale of this Hebrew slave trying to force himself on her. And Potiphar, hearing this story from his tearful wife, throws Joseph in jail. And all along, we never see Joseph screaming of his innocence. We never see him trying to defend himself and explain the situation. He has unwavering faith. Because Joseph understands this idea that we talked about last week, that personal integrity is greater than public praise. Though we may be trying to rise, climb the corporate ladder to have a certain influence over people, and maybe you've thought that my faith can't be out there so much that I lose opportunities to be promoted, or I lose opportunities to have an influence one day in the future. If we look at the life of Joseph, we start living that life out, we realize that God is greater glorified by our personal integrity than any place that we may land one day, any influence that we might have one day. Public praise is nice, but God's glory is greater glorified when we are personally making decisions that honor Him on a daily basis, even when it's to our detriment. So that brings us to this point in the story, and Joseph's now in prison, and he's in the maximum security prison. He's where Pharaoh's prisoners are held. And he's again, an upstanding man, high character, and the chief of the guard kind of recognizes this in Joseph and starts to put Joseph in charge of all the things there in the prison. And you think, okay, well, I've heard this story before, right? The prison guard puts him in charge of the things. But then what happens is these two guys who work for Pharaoh get put into prison. And the two guys are the baker and the cupbearer. Okay, if you don't remember, if you're not familiar with kind of old kingdom activity, the king would always have a cupbearer. The cupbearer's job was to make sure that whatever the Pharaoh, the king, or whatever government they're in, whatever he was going to drink was safe from poison. So the cupbearer not only probably squeezed the grapes and made the wine, was in charge of that entire process, but he also had to taste it and make sure that it wasn't poisoned. And then he would actually physically put the cup in the Pharaoh's hand. And this other guy, the baker, he was there, and whatever happened, there was something happened, that maybe the Pharaoh had a bad day, he throws both of these guys in prison. And here these guys find themselves almost kind of in the care of Joseph. And Joseph sees them one day, and they are just really depressed, and he notices that. And the thing that I see that in chapter 39, chapter 40, when I see that, when I read this story, I recognize that Joseph wasn't just taking care of the job he had. Joseph wasn't just taking care of the responsibilities that he'd been entrusted to. Joseph was actually involved in the lives of the people he was in charge of. Because he noticed that these other guys in prison with him, there was something wrong with them that day. And so as you look at your life, whether it's your family or your neighbors or your coworkers, or maybe it's your employees, like, are you just getting the job done? Or are you actually looking to see if God might use you to impact their lives? Can you recognize when they're having a bad day and it's not work-related? Joseph could. So we see Joseph in chapter 40, in verse 8, he actually comes to them, and this is what they say. They said to him, if you have a Bible, you can go ahead and turn to Genesis chapter 40. I'd love for you to turn there and highlight some of these things. We're going to be kind of jumping a couple of chapters today, but we're highlighting a couple of verses. We'll put this on the screen as well. But this is Genesis chapter 40, and this is where Joseph comes to them, and he says, what's going on? What's wrong with you? What's up? And they said to him, we have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them. And Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me. Now, right there, Joseph kind of establishes something that we struggle to establish in our own lives. And I talked about this last week a little bit, that when we do something good, that we kind of almost by accident take full credit for it. We just kind of accidentally believe that we're really, really good at what we're doing. And so Joseph right there says, if anything happens from this point forward, it's God. It's him. He has done something, he is doing something, and it doesn't have anything to do with me. And so he tells them, these two guys tell them their dreams. And the cupbearer tells them this dream. He has this dream. It says, there were 3 branches, and I squeezed the grapes into the cup, and then I put the cup in Pharaoh's hand. And Joseph was like, okay, here's the deal. Here's what that dream means. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh is going to take you out of prison. He's going to put you back in your job, and you once again will be putting the cup back into Pharaoh's hand. That's a pretty good dream. That's a good day for that guy. So the baker, he's sitting there hearing this. He's like, well, dang. Let me tell you my dream. And so he does. He says, I'm standing there, and I've got these baskets on my head, these 3 baskets, and they're full of all kinds of baked goods and all kinds of yum stuff, and these birds, they're eating out of the top basket. And Joseph looks at him and he goes, oh. You sure you don't need to use the bathroom or something? He didn't say that, but this is what he says. He said, man, here's what your dream means. Then in 3 days, Pharaoh's going to take you out of prison as well, but he's going to kill you. He's going to crucify you, and the birds of the air are going to eat your flesh. That's not so much a good dream. I woke up at 5:15 this morning and kind of had a mini panic attack thinking that the building was going to be full of water, and I almost drove up here. That's not that bad. I'll take that dream versus, birds plucking my eyeballs out of my head, And I gotta think, for me, again, I read the Bible and I picture it like in real life. And so I picture these three guys kind of sitting around, and Joseph's kind of sitting up on this little rock, and the other guys are sitting there in Indian style. And, well, here's what happened. And the wine guy tells him his, and Joseph's like, well, here's what yours is. And yeah, awesome. 3 days, here we go, start countdown. And the baker's like, yeah, let's tell him. And he tells him, and then Joseph interprets his dream, and then they're just sitting there looking at each other. So 3 days, huh? You guys want to play checkers? I can't imagine what the dynamic was at that point. What do you do for the next 3 days if that's true? Now, these guys don't know that that's all going to come true. It's just some Hebrew slave in prison who's in charge telling them what's going to happen. So there's not that much. We know it all comes true because we have the benefit of history. These guys don't know yet. But 3 days go by. It's actually, I think it's Pharaoh's birthday or something like that, and everything happens exactly like Joseph had said. And Joseph tells the cupbearer, he says, listen, when this happens to you, I only ask that you will remember me. And this is the only time we see Joseph saying, I was a Hebrew slave, sold by my family, and falsely put into prison. Please remember me when you're back in Pharaoh's good graces. And so, like the rest of us, when something good happens, we completely forget about all the things we said we'd do in the past, right? And he goes back to his job and he forgets all about it until, in chapter 41, Pharaoh has a couple of strange dreams. He has these dreams and he starts asking all of his advisors and all of these spiritual people to come and interpret his dream, and nobody can do it. And there's the cupbearer, I imagine, sitting in the background, just checking Facebook on his phone, and hearing this, and hearing Pharaoh getting mad, and you're like, oh, crap, Joseph, shoot. Now, it's been 2 years at this point. Yeah, if you think your friends have forgot you to pick you up, and they're 20 minutes late, try 2 years, okay? So this guy's like, oh, wait, I know, Pharaoh. There was this guy in prison with me, and we had these dreams, and he told us the interpretation, and it's exactly what happened. He said that you were going to put me back in my job. Thanks, by the way. Appreciate you. Love you. And then he said that you were going to kill the baker. You remember that? The guy you crucified, and the birds came, and plop, plop, right? That guy. He told us that, and it happened. You should bring him in. And so he does. And here's the thing. In verse 15 in chapter 41, this is what it says. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream. This is different than what you might remember from American history. So this is, just remember, okay? I've had a dream, and there's no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Now, pause right there for a second. Joseph has been living in Egypt for somewhere around 12 to 14 years at this point. He was 17 when he went there. And he's been living a life of character. He's been quiet. He's been honorable. He's been put in places of authority and responsibility. He's living his life not to keep out of trouble. He's living his life to honor God. He's living a life of faith. And when you live a life of faith, it gets people talking. A life lived in faith gets people talking. You see, if you decide to truly live your faith out in every area of your life, not just at home, not just at mealtime when you pray with your kids, not just at bedtime, not just when you're cutting the grass and you start praying that God will make it rain so you don't have to, not just when you get a bad bill, not when you have a bad diagnosis, but you're living a life of faith in every aspect of your life, people will start to notice. all the way up to Pharaoh, people notice that something's different about this Joseph guy, because a life lived in faith gets people talking. And so this is what Joseph says to him, verse 16. Verse 16 there. Let's throw that up. Joseph answered Pharaoh, "It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer." So once again, Joseph establishes that it's not him. And listen, when you have an opportunity to improve your station in life, when you have an opportunity to kind of get some credit with the people who can make a change in your life, you're going to be tempted to take the credit. If there were ever a situation in Joseph's life where he could let himself be seen in a good light, this was it. Pharaoh had all the power. As a matter of fact, Pharaoh thought he was God. He has the power not only to take Joseph out of prison, but to make his life completely different. And so when you're faced with opportunities to improve your situation in life, how are you going to respond? Are you going to live a life of faith, giving God all the glory? Because that's what Joseph did. I mean, I don't think there's a single one of us in that situation that are going to say, when Pharaoh says to us, "Hey, I've heard that you can interpret dreams. I'm in charge. I have a dream. I want you to interpret it." Most of us are going to say, "I can do that. Let's hear it. Let's go. Let's rock and roll there, Pharaoh. All right?" Not many of us are going to say, "Sorry, I can't do it, but God can." That's not to say anything about you. That's probably me. I'm probably not thinking far enough ahead to think, this is an opportunity to put God's glory on display. I'm thinking, I can save my butt right now. But Joseph doesn't, because Joseph's living a life of faith. And so he does. Pharaoh tells him his story, his dreams. He has two dreams. The first dream is he sees these cows come up out of the Nile. Okay? These fat, full, heavy, good-looking heifers, right? Come strutting their stuff out. Just picture like the Chick-fil-A cow and all his friends just coming up out of the thing, all right? And they come up out of the Nile and they're good. But then these other cows, these skinny, nasty looking, y'all remember that commercial for soy milk or something? They had the animated cows, they're skinny, they're that way, and then they turn this way and they're skinny. You're like, no, that ain't gonna give me no steak. That's no good, right? Well, then these cows come up out of the Nile and they eat the fat cows, but nothing happens to the skinny cows. They're still skinny. So that's a weird dream. What did you have for dinner, Pharaoh? That would be my first question. Well, how much did you drink, cupbearer? What you been doing, man? Right? Then he has another dream. He tells him the other dream, that there's 7 fat ears of corn. And then there's another sprout of these nasty, skinny looking ears of corn. And as they fall, they eat up the fat ears of corn. And nothing happens to the skinny, nasty ones. And that's weird. And Joseph says, here's what's going to happen. The fact that you had these 2 dreams confirms that God is going to do what he said he's going to do. And you're going to have these years of plenty. You're going to have so much. You're going to be so overflowing with harvest, you're not going to know what to do with it. But then, immediately following that, you're going to have another series of years that are so bad, that the harvest is so bad, you're going to have such a huge famine that it will eat up all the surplus that you think you have. But you can change that right now, Pharaoh. You can put people in place. You can put things into action right now so that you're prepared for those years of famine. And Pharaoh looks at him, he says, well, who else to do it but you? And so he takes this Hebrew slave and he gets him cleaned up and shaven. He puts a ring on his hand. He puts clothes on his back. As a matter of fact, he puts him second in command of everything in the Egyptian nation. It says that when Joseph would ride by on a chariot, that people would bow their knee to him. That's how big a life change has happened for him. And for me, I naturally look at that and think, man, that's incredible. That's incredible what God has done. But here's the thing. Oh, that was gross. That was my lifesaver. Here's the thing about this. When I read this story, I see that and like God is just showing off in the life of Joseph. He is showing off. He's saying, I took this slave who was forgotten by his family and I have plucked him up and I've saved his life to show off God's glory. But it's so much more than that. And listen, if you've ever struggled to understand why the Old Testament matters to us, that why we have all these stories, let me tell you, this is a perfect example to explain why you need to read the Bible, why you need to know the history of God's people. Because this is a brilliant insight. Vodi Bokum is a pastor, and he has this quote. Look at this. God's redemptive plan for Joseph wasn't to put him in charge, but to spare Judah's life for the coming Christ. Judah was one of those brothers that sold Joseph into slavery. And Judah is the line by which the prophecy said the Messiah was going to come. So if Judah died in the famine, the prophecy for Jesus and the Messiah is gone. But God pulled up this Hebrew slave, saved his life, and put him in charge so that his brother, who was still living in another land, who had no idea that the famine was coming, was going to be spared so that Jesus Christ could come for you and for me. That's beautiful, isn't it? That's incredible. When I read these Old Testament stories, I struggle to put the pieces together and see the threads. But that's it right there. And the thing about this is, it doesn't stop with this story. This is your story. As I lived and worked for years with students, I'd see students who came from horrible family backgrounds. I didn't understand why they came to church because their parents weren't supportive. Their parents, sometimes their parents were kind of combative with them in their faith. So I don't know what your story is. I don't know what your family history is, but maybe you don't like it. Maybe you don't like your job right now. Maybe you don't like where you live or the circumstances that you find yourself in right now. I'm sure that Joseph didn't like being sold into slavery, lied about, put into prison as a rapist, and then forgotten. I'm sure he didn't enjoy that. But Joseph was convinced that if he lived a life of faith, that God was still in control. Joseph knew that God could do something regardless of the circumstances that he understood in his life. And for you, you need to decide right now that looking at my circumstances, whether I like them or not, whether they're pleasant or they're difficult, that I'm going to live a life of faith from this point forward. For God's glory, not my own. I'm going to live a life of faith from this point forward because I don't know what God might be doing with my future and the future of my family and the future of my company and the future of my neighborhood. Joseph had no idea that his rise to power was so that the Messiah could come and give new life to the world. But that's exactly what purpose it was. And you choosing to honor God in that crappy job, and you choosing to honor God despite your broken and dysfunctional family, and you choosing to honor God every single day can make a difference in the future for generations to come. You see, a life lived in faith proclaims that God's in control. So I'm not asking you to put a happy face on and sing worship music as you walk to work. Oceans, whatever. That's fake. I'm not asking you to be fake. I'm asking you to believe that God is in control, despite what the circumstances of your life may tell you. Because as we look at this story in Joseph, we look at his life in faith, we see that yes, God is in control, and yes, God is up to something, and he just might be up to something in your life as well. So faith, what kind of faith does that take? What kind of faith does it take to be a person like that? Simple faith. That I believe that my God is alive and he is in control. So the challenge today to each and every one of us, your job, your family, your neighborhood, your housing situation, your unemployment situation, whatever it is, be determined to live a life of faith from this point forward, not looking back. Because listen, we are no longer slaves to this world. You see, we just sang those songs. I have decided to follow Jesus. Man, it's such a great old hymn. So much rich theology and history and feel in that. We sang that new song today. I'm no longer a slave to sin. I am a child of God. We sang about the amazing grace that sets us free from sin. But if all we do is sit in rooms like this facing forward, singing songs like that, it means nothing. We have got to get out of this building, into our homes, into our schools, into our places of employment, and live lives of faith so that God can put His glory on display in your life. You never know what He might be up to when you choose to trust Him in faith. That's what those baptisms are all about. They're not saying they're perfect. They're not saying they fully understand it. They're saying, I understand enough that God's in control, that He saved me for some reason. He loves me. So I'm going to live my life for Him forever. Bow your heads for me. I'm not asking you to come down and do anything like that. I want to do this so that I can pray for you. If you're here today and something about what we just read together kind of struck a chord in your heart, maybe you're facing a difficult circumstance and you're struggling to really choose the life of faith, would you raise your hand just so I can be praying for you? Just so, okay, all right, okay. There's a lot of us. We'll put those hands down. Today, when you leave, your prayer needs to be, God, help me to live a life of faith. Give me the strength to trust you. Tomorrow, when you wake up, your prayer needs to be, God, give me the strength I need to live a life of faith, to trust you. Tomorrow at lunch, your prayer needs to be, God, give me the strength I need to live a life of faith and to trust you. And I will be praying for you. Let's pray together. Jesus, thank you so much. Thank you for the stories that we've heard today, for the people that you have put your mighty work on display in. Thank you for the life of Joseph, the incredible display of faith and glory that we learn from. Jesus, there are so many of us that are facing circumstances that are just challenging and difficult and seemingly insurmountable. So today, Lord, we ask that you would rule in our lives, that you would give us the strength we need for today to live lives of faith, not for our improvement, but for your glory. And God, if you should choose to use our faithful lives for the future glory of your church and for the future glory of our families, help us to be okay with that. Help us to surrender to your will. Jesus, thank you for these wonderful, wonderful people that gather together in places all across our city and our state and our world like this. Pray you would bless your church. He would strengthen us and let us live lives that scream out loud that we are no longer slaves to fear or to sin. That your amazing grace would be on display in our lives. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.